What could make two brothers commit such an unimaginable crime against their closest friends? A bond built on trust and shared history was shattered in an instant by something far more unsettling than anyone could have expected. The question doesn't just haunt the minds of investigators and those who knew them, it lingers in the air, heavy with the unsettling weight of its answer. On January 1, 2018, in the small, peaceful town of Randall, Washington, two young men invited their friend over to ring in the new year. To most, it seemed like just another night, a casual gathering between old friends, a moment to drink, laugh, and talk about life. But within the walls of that secluded cabin, a different reality was unfolding, one that would end in unimaginable violence, forever changing the lives of everyone involved. Benjamin Eastman III was 16. He had a life ahead of him, he was popular, athletic, and had the kind of future most kids only dream of. He trusted the two brothers, Jonathan Adamson and Benito Marquez. They were supposed to be his friends, people he could rely on. But that trust was about to be torn apart, in the most brutal way. As the night went on, something shifted. It wasn't immediately obvious, not to Benjamin, not to anyone around him. But the brothers' behavior began to grow more intense. The laughter grew quieter, and the smiles faded, replaced by something darker, a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. What started as innocent fun gradually shifted into something more dangerous, and more disturbing. Benjamin, unaware of the growing threat, sent a final text to his family, saying everything was fine. But it wasn't. It was far from fine. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares. Benjamin was found hours later, alone, lifeless in a secluded area. His body showed signs of violent struggle, of betrayal. It was clear something had gone horribly wrong. It was as if he had been abandoned in the worst way imaginable. The brothers, Jonathan and Benito, denied any involvement. They claimed to have no idea what happened to their friend. But investigators were already piecing together the truth. And the more they dug, the more they realized this wasn't a simple accident or a tragic event. There was something more at play, something buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It was clear that the brothers weren't as innocent as they claimed. Their stories didn't match up. Key pieces of evidence, DNA, surveillance footage, and witnesses, began to point in one direction. And as the truth slowly unraveled, it became apparent that this was no random act of violence. There was something much darker beneath it all. Something driven by obsession, something deeply rooted in the brothers' complex relationship. What would make two brothers, people who grew up together, shared memories, and knew each other better than anyone else, commit such a horrific crime? What twisted sense of power or control could have driven them to betray their friend in such a brutal manner? The answer wasn't easy to accept, but it was clear, something had pushed them past the point of no return. As the investigation continued, the story took unexpected turns. Each revelation felt more shocking than the last. The brothers, once seen as loyal friends, were now being unmasked for who they truly were. The evidence, the confessions, the testimonies, all pointed to a terrifying truth that no one had expected. But what could have caused the brothers to act in such an appalling way? Was it a desire for power, a need to dominate? Or something else, something far deeper, something hidden in the shadows of their shared history? As the truth came to light, it became clear that the crime was only the tip of the iceberg. And still, questions remained. Could there have been more victims? Were the brothers hiding even more secrets than anyone realized? As the case went to trial, the world watched, waiting for answers that seemed just out of reach. And through it all, one thing was certain, the tragic fate of Benjamin Eastman would haunt Randall, Washington, forever. And the brothers who betrayed their friend would carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. The investigation into the deaths of Benjamin Eastman III and the horrifying involvement of the Adamson brothers began slowly. At first, the town of Randall had no idea how deeply it would be shaken. Neighbors and friends, those who had known Jonathan and Benito since childhood, struggled to believe the allegations. These weren't menacing strangers or criminals from out of town. These were two brothers who had grown up in the same community as Benjamin, and who had shared laughs, late-night conversations, and countless memories. To the people who knew them, they seemed like good kids, maybe a little wild at times, but nothing out of the ordinary. But as the case unfolded, the picture painted by the evidence was far different from the one painted by their friends and family. The brothers were not the innocent young men they appeared to be. Beneath their friendly exterior, dark secrets began to emerge, secrets that would eventually tear apart the image of the tight-knit community they had once been a part of. It all started with the discovery of Benjamin's body, lying discarded in the woods, far from the cabin where he had been with Jonathan and Benito. His family had been frantically calling him for hours after they received that last text, but there was no response. They knew something was wrong. When Benjamin's body was finally found, it was clear that he had been violently attacked. The autopsy report confirmed the family's worst fears. Blunt force trauma to the head, signs of restraint, and evidence of a struggle. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't a random tragedy. It was something planned, something calculated. It was murder. Investigators immediately turned their attention to the brothers, Jonathan and Benito. They were the last ones seen with Benjamin, and their accounts of the night were filled with holes. Jonathan, the older brother, was calm but evasive when questioned. He claimed that Benjamin had simply gone missing during the night, and that he had no idea what had happened to him. Benito, the younger of the two, appeared to be more distraught, but his statements were inconsistent. At first, he said he was too drunk to remember much, but then he contradicted himself, saying he had heard sounds in the night, sounds that didn't add up. As investigators dug deeper, it became apparent that the brothers' stories didn't match the physical evidence. Forensic teams discovered traces of blood on the brothers' clothing, and DNA evidence found at the scene of the crime was linked directly to both Jonathan and Benito. This wasn't an isolated act of violence. This was premeditated. And what made it even more disturbing was the bond that these brothers shared. It wasn't just a family connection, it was something deeper, something twisted that no one could have predicted. The first breakthrough in the case came when a key piece of surveillance footage from a gas station outside Randall was uncovered. The footage showed the brothers, hours before Benjamin's death, walking together with him, laughing, talking. They looked like any other group of young men, enjoying their night, heading back to the cabin. But as the video played on, it was clear that there was tension. Jonathan and Benito were noticeably close, almost too close for comfort, walking in sync, exchanging glances that made those watching the footage uncomfortable. That footage was just the beginning. Investigators soon discovered something far more chilling. Beneath the brothers' seemingly innocent relationship was a history of controlling behavior, manipulation, and obsession. The brothers' behavior toward Benjamin was anything but normal. They had always been possessive of him, demanding his attention, and isolating him from others. As interviews with friends and classmates of the three young men were conducted, patterns began to emerge, patterns that pointed to a disturbing obsession. Jonathan had long held a dominant role in his relationship with Benito, pushing his younger brother into dangerous situations and encouraging risky behaviors. It became apparent that Jonathan had used his influence over Benito to manipulate him into joining him in this terrible crime. Benito, while often seen as the more naive of the two, was vulnerable to Jonathan's control. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Benito had been pressured, coerced, and even threatened into carrying out the horrific act alongside his brother. But what exactly triggered the violence that night? What pushed Jonathan and Benito to such extremes? The answer lay in their fractured psychological state, which was exposed as the case developed. Friends of the brothers reported that Jonathan had been growing increasingly possessive of Benito, not just as a brother but as an extension of himself. He couldn't stand the thought of Benito growing up, becoming independent, and having his own relationships outside of their toxic dynamic. And Benjamin's friendship with Benito only fueled Jonathan's resentment. But even with this disturbing insight, the true motive behind Benjamin's murder was still unclear. What caused two brothers, who had once been close friends with him, to turn so violently against him? Was it a fit of jealousy over Benjamin's popularity, his success, and his life outside of their small circle? As investigators continued to unravel the events of that tragic night, they found more disturbing clues. The brothers' behavior after the murder was chillingly cold. They cleaned the crime scene meticulously, removing evidence, and destroying anything that could be linked back to them. It was almost as if they believed they could escape the consequences of their actions. But they were wrong. And the more they tried to cover up their tracks, the more evidence surfaced, leading to their eventual downfall. The final confrontation came when Benito, under intense pressure, broke down and confessed to the crime. In a raw, emotional statement, he admitted that he had been complicit in Benjamin's death and that he had been driven by a mixture of fear and manipulation. But he also revealed something shocking: Jonathan had been the mastermind behind the murder. He had orchestrated every step of the plan, pulling Benito along with him, using his power and influence over him to get him to do the unthinkable. When Jonathan was confronted with the truth, he denied it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. His demeanor shifted, he went from calm and controlled to erratic and defensive. He knew his world was falling apart, and he wasn't ready to accept the consequences. But the walls were closing in. The case went to trial, and the world watched as the details of the brothers' twisted actions were revealed. The trial became a spectacle, with shocking testimonies, forensic evidence, and psychological profiles that painted a haunting portrait of two young men who had allowed their dark desires and unhealthy relationships to consume them. The brothers were eventually convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and other charges, with both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town of Randall, once a place of peace and tranquility, was forever changed. The crime had shattered the community's sense of safety and trust, leaving behind a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. The trial of Jonathan Adamson and Benito Marquez was a spectacle. For weeks, the courtroom was filled with the weight of suspense. The small town of Randall, Washington, watched in disbelief as the brothers sat in the defendant's box, their faces an unreadable mask of defiance and regret, defiant of their actions, yet clearly aware of the storm that was about to tear their lives apart. The town had once known them as young, promising individuals, brothers who shared everything from their childhood to their dreams. Now, those dreams were shattered, and the reality of their heinous crime was being laid bare for all to see. The prosecution laid out the details of the murder with chilling precision. Benjamin Eastman had been lured into that cabin under the guise of a simple celebration, a celebration that had quickly turned into something far more monstrous. The evidence revealed that Jonathan and Benito had not simply murdered Benjamin in a moment of rage, but had carefully planned and executed the crime in the most despicable way. Forensic analysis confirmed that Benjamin had fought desperately for his life. His blood was found all over the cabin, as he struggled with his attackers in an attempt to break free. It was clear from the physical evidence that he had been restrained, assaulted, and brutalized before his life was ultimately snuffed out. But what made the crime so horrifying was not just the violence, it was the sheer betrayal. Benjamin had trusted the brothers. He had considered them his friends, people he could rely on. And yet, they had shattered that trust in the most brutal of ways. The DNA evidence, the surveillance footage from the gas station, and the various witness testimonies all pointed to one undeniable truth: Jonathan and Benito had killed Benjamin. Benito's confession, given under intense pressure, had been the turning point in the case. His breakdown in the interrogation room had exposed the brothers' twisted dynamic. In his statement, he described how Jonathan had pressured him, and how he had been manipulated into helping carry out the murder. Benito had confessed that he had been afraid of Jonathan's dominance, of his older brother's overwhelming influence. He spoke of the years of control Jonathan had exercised over him, pulling the strings, isolating him from others, and turning him against their friends, including Benjamin. Benito admitted to the rape of Benjamin as well, though he claimed he had been coerced by Jonathan. The graphic and horrific details that emerged during the confession were enough to make anyone shudder. The attack on Benjamin had not been a crime of passion. It had been cold, calculated, and planned with a disturbing sense of purpose. And as Benito spoke, it became painfully clear that the brothers had done more than just murder their friend, they had sought to dominate him in every possible way. Jonathan's response to the accusations was one of denial and rage. He maintained that he had not coerced Benito and that he was innocent of the crime. But the jury saw through his lies. Jonathan's manipulation of Benito was laid bare in the testimony. His control over his younger brother was not just psychological, it was physical, emotional, and deeply ingrained in their relationship. Benito, it seemed, was nothing more than a follower, a victim in his own right, trapped in a web of manipulation he couldn't escape. As the trial wore on, more disturbing details emerged about the brothers' past. They had been raised in an unstable household, their father having been abusive and distant, their mother emotionally unavailable. The brothers had turned to each other for comfort, and over time, that bond had warped into something unhealthy, something toxic. Jonathan had taken on the role of protector, but it wasn't just protection, he controlled Benito in ways that went beyond brotherly care. He used fear, guilt, and emotional manipulation to keep Benito under his thumb, to make him feel indebted and incapable of breaking free. Witnesses described the brothers' strange relationship as something beyond the norm. Jonathan was possessive of Benito, constantly pushing him to be more like him, to follow him, to do his bidding. And when Benjamin entered their lives, Jonathan's insecurities flared. He saw Benjamin as a threat to his hold over Benito. To Jonathan, Benjamin was a distraction, someone who could pull Benito away from him, someone who could potentially break their bond. And that, ultimately, was what led to the unspeakable crime. The closing statements in the trial were heartbreaking. The family of Benjamin Eastman was in the courtroom, their faces a mixture of grief, disbelief, and anger. They had lost their son, their brother, to a pair of men who had once been close friends, who had once been like family. And now, as they sat in that courtroom, they had to hear the grisly details of his final hours. The prosecutor spoke passionately about the brutality of the crime, the coldness of the brothers' actions, and the impact it had on the Eastman family. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They claimed that Benito had been the one solely responsible for the crime and that Jonathan had been coerced and manipulated into helping him. They argued that Jonathan had no intent to kill Benjamin and that he had only been trying to protect his brother. But the jury wasn't swayed by these claims. The evidence spoke for itself. The verdict came down after a tense deliberation. Both Jonathan Adamson and Benito Marquez were found guilty of first-degree murder, rape, and multiple other charges. The courtroom was silent as the judge pronounced their sentences, life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that could never bring back Benjamin Eastman, but it was a sentence that brought a measure of justice to the family and the community that had been torn apart by the crime. As the brothers were escorted out of the courtroom, their faces were devoid of emotion. Jonathan's expression remained cold and defiant, while Benito's was more resigned as if he had finally accepted the consequences of his actions. But neither of them could escape the reality of what they had done, and neither of them could undo the pain they had caused. The town of Randall, Washington, would never be the same. The shock of the crime, the betrayal, and the brutal violence had left a scar on the community that would never heal. What seemed like an ordinary gathering between friends turned into a nightmarish tragedy, one that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. And though the brothers may be locked away behind bars, the questions that linger, what truly drove them to commit such a brutal crime, and how much of their twisted relationship was to blame, remain unanswered, leaving only the echoes of a terrible betrayal in their wake. As the dust settled following the trial, the small town of Randall was left to piece together the wreckage. The locals had been shaken to their core. The Adamson brothers had been fixtures in the community, their family is well known, and their faces familiar. Benjamin Eastman's family, though devastated by the loss of their son, fought to maintain their dignity in the face of overwhelming grief. His parents quietly shattered and kept to themselves, but their pain was visible in every glance they exchanged, every interaction with those who expressed their condolences. His sister, a strong-willed woman, became the public voice of the family, speaking out about the senselessness of the crime, the lasting damage it had caused, and the need for justice to be served, not just for Benjamin, but for all victims of violent crimes. In the weeks after the trial, local media outlets, already hungry for sensational stories, began to dig deeper into the lives of the Adamson brothers. They combed through old records, talked to family members, and interviewed former friends. It wasn't long before they uncovered more disturbing details about Jonathan and Benito's childhood. They discovered that the brothers had been raised in an environment where violence was commonplace. Their father, a man with a history of substance abuse and erratic behavior, had been a domineering figure in their lives. Their mother, though physically present, had always been emotionally distant, unable to shield her sons from the chaos at home. Both Jonathan and Benito had experienced traumatic events in their early years, events that would shape their future actions in ways that few could have anticipated. It was in this environment, full of emotional and physical abuse, that their bond was forged, a bond that would later lead them down the path to murder. As the investigation into the brothers' past gained momentum, the media began to paint a picture of two men who had never been able to escape the grip of their upbringing. Interviews with former classmates and teachers painted Jonathan as an aggressive and domineering figure, someone who was always in control and expected others to fall in line. Benito, in contrast, was described as quiet, almost invisible, someone who avoided conflict and never seemed to speak up for himself. The contrast between the two brothers was striking. Jonathan was the bully, and Benito the victim. In the weeks following the trial, investigators and reporters uncovered more about the brutal nature of the assault on Benjamin Eastman. The evidence from the crime scene revealed a level of premeditation that was chilling. The brothers had carefully planned every step of the evening. They had chosen their victim, Benjamin, because he was the one person who could potentially disrupt the balance of power between them. The crime had been carried out with a disturbing level of coordination. They had drugged Benjamin, rendering him unconscious before they began their assault. And yet, even in his incapacitated state, Benjamin had managed to fight back, to scream, to try to escape. His final moments, those moments of desperation and terror, were forever captured in the physical evidence found at the scene. The struggle he had put up, the blood left behind in his efforts to survive, painted a picture of a man who had fought for his life against overwhelming odds. As the weeks turned to months, the case continued to reverberate throughout the community. People began to question everything they thought they knew about Jonathan and Benito. As the months passed, the families of both the victims and the perpetrators were forced to confront the consequences of what had happened. Benjamin's family had to come to terms with the loss of their son, a loss that would never truly heal. Jonathan and Benito's family, once proud and close-knit, was now divided, their reputation forever tarnished by the actions of the two brothers. In the end, the story of the Adamson brothers was a tale of manipulation, betrayal, and violence. It was a story that revealed the darkest corners of the human mind, how fear, control, and power could twist the bonds of friendship and family into something unrecognizable. It was a story that left behind a wake of shattered lives and unanswered questions. The question of why Jonathan and Benito had committed such a horrific crime may never be fully answered, but one thing was certain: their actions would haunt Randall, Washington, for generations to come. The Adamson family, once well-respected and embedded in the fabric of the town, was now viewed with suspicion. The father, Tom Adamson, had vanished from public life entirely, retreating into the background, avoiding the media and anyone who might question him about his son's actions. His wife, Carol, had once been known for her warm smile and friendly demeanor, but now, her face was a mask of grief and regret. She rarely left the house, often seen only when she made short trips to the grocery store, her eyes hollow, as though the weight of what had happened had drained her of everything she once was. She never spoke of her sons, and her silence spoke volumes. The years after the trial were a time of reflection for many in Randall. Residents began to look at their own lives, and their own families, and ask questions. How had this tragedy come to pass in such a seemingly peaceful town? Was it possible that there had been signs all along, things they had missed, small whispers of warning that they hadn't taken seriously? The questions never seemed to stop. Benjamin Eastman's death had, in many ways, forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths. Randall, like many small towns, had always prided itself on its sense of community and safety. The idea that something so horrific could happen in their midst was hard to accept. In the years following the crime, people began to re-examine the relationships in their own lives, especially those that seemed too perfect, too unquestioned. The story of the Adamson brothers had shattered any illusions about the ease with which violence could strike, and how even the most trusted people could harbor dark secrets. As for the families of the victims, the pain never fully healed. Benjamin's parents tried to keep their lives together, but on every anniversary of their son's death, every mention of the crime in the local news brought back the crushing grief. Benjamin's mother, especially, had a difficult time. She had been the one to pick up the pieces when her son had disappeared without a trace, and she had been the one to hold out hope, despite the mounting evidence against the brothers. When the truth came out, it was a blow she had never fully recovered from. Benjamin's name was always in her heart, and she often found herself visiting his grave, sitting there for hours, speaking to him as though he could still hear her. As the years passed, questions surrounding the Adamson brothers' motivations persisted. Some investigators believed that there was more to the story than had been uncovered during the trial. There were whispers that Jonathan had been involved in other, more sinister activities, though none of these suspicions had ever been proven. His behavior, his ability to manipulate and control, his apparent lack of remorse, all of these were signs of a deeply disturbed individual. But what had driven him to act on his dark impulses in such a brutal and calculated way? One question that continued to plague investigators and the public alike was whether Benito had truly been coerced or whether, on some level, he had been complicit in the murder. Benito had claimed during his trial that he had been manipulated by Jonathan, but there were moments when his story didn't quite add up. Some believed that Benito had known more than he had let on, that he had been an active participant in the crime, despite his claims of being under his brother's control. The psychological dynamics between the two brothers were difficult to untangle, but they were central to understanding the events that led to Benjamin Eastman's tragic death. The case was far from closed, and the mystery surrounding the Adamson brothers would never fully be solved. The victims, their families, and the town of Randall had to live with the reality of what had happened, but there was no simple explanation, no clear-cut answers. The crime had exposed a web of darkness that stretched far beyond the brothers and their twisted relationship. It was a story that would continue to haunt everyone who had been touched by it, a story of manipulation, betrayal, and an unimaginable loss. As time went on, the chilling reality of what had happened would serve as a reminder of how easily trust could be shattered and how violence could erupt, even in the most unexpected places. As the story of the Adamson brothers comes to a close, the question remains, could this have been prevented? Was there a sign, a warning, that we missed? What truly drove them to commit such a heinous act? These are questions that will never fully be answered, but they linger in our minds, reminding us that darkness can exist where we least expect it. If you found this case as chilling and haunting as we have, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Benito was coerced, or do you think he played a more active role in the crime? Do you think the right people were held accountable? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to stay informed on more unsettling true crime stories, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. Like this video if you believe justice should always prevail, and share it with friends or family who are fascinated by real-life mysteries.